And thanks everybody for the time today. Really appreciate it. And yeah, hopefully you do find this insightful. It's something very near and dear to us here. Our group has done a lot of Copilot deployments since it became available in general availability late 2023, early 2024. And we've been involved in a lot of AI initiatives at healthcare organizations of various sizes, from tens of thousands of users to sub 5,000 seats as well. And actually, we've won some awards and Microsoft recognition late last year for the work that we've done specifically around AI and Copilot. We've also, however, done numerous deployments in other industries and verticals, but I think it's obvious, and we can all agree that healthcare presents some unique considerations and approaches, starting just with the highly regulated nature of healthcare data and clinical contexts. So introducing AI into clinical scenarios brings with it its own unique set of conversations that I don't really think are found elsewhere, like whether AI falls under CDS or clinical decision support exemptions, the regulatory and legal sort of inspection and review of AI initiatives in a clinical scenario, considerations around potential biases or ethics and equity in clinical contexts, etc. But all that said, I was super excited to put together some of this content to be able to think sort of holistically about our work in healthcare and talk about some of the salient characteristics and approaches that make the Copilot's deployments we've seen successful. So hopefully you'll find this informative. But that said, I know each organization's at a different spot in terms of their AI journey. So always open to feedback, which you can throw into chat. If there's certain other topics of discussion you'd like us to think about and prepare for in the future, would love to hear back from that. Okay, so I'll start to dive into the conversation here. So just an overview, there's a too long didn't read where basically I'll provide the scope of the discussion today and just briefly highlight 4 themes that are going to run throughout our conversation. Then we'll look at the MIT NANDA paper, which you might recall got a lot of attention last year and raised alarms about how much ROI organizations were actually seeing from AI. And it even caused the markets to shed billions of dollars of value overnight. So I'll talk about what I think is possibly flawed or misleading in terms of its methods and its findings. But more importantly, I'll talk about some of what I think are the persistent and durable insights that they spell out. And I'll add to those about what we've seen in our own experience with AI initiatives in healthcare. And then I'll use that as a springboard to talk about what we've seen succeed. And hopefully that provides some practical detail that maybe you haven't found elsewhere, or maybe is validating to what you're doing today. And then from there, I'll take a look at what a good AI partner looks like. This is not necessarily Ravanti centric. This is anybody who you're partnering with, vendor or partner in the AI space. Since the nature of AI and sort of the lessons and approaches we discuss here require a very different kind of partner conversation. And then lastly, we'll look at Copilot 365, which is how my group approaches Copilot deployments and is really grounded in some of the lessons, findings, learnings that are here. And then, of course, we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. So jumping right in, in this discussion, we're looking specifically at healthcare organizations that first have successfully demonstrated ROI with AI and have taken that demonstrable success to then move past a pilot phase an experimental phase and deploy more broadly to their production workforce. And from there, using the success that we found in the production workforce, have then used that to create lower risk, lower cost, and a faster agent development pipeline. So all moving from human and assistant to an agentic framework. And how are organizations doing this? These are really some of the main themes that run throughout this conversation. I just thought I'd put them up front. While some sort of directional vision is always going to be required, what's most impactful and what gets budget approval and what allows organizations to advance from one phase to the next is creating a track record rather than a vision. So we'll touch on that probably a few times throughout this discussion. And then secondarily, how do you create that track record? That's really built through narrow, high-value use cases that are piloted in a measurable way to prove out ROI and to then make a case for, say, further investment or adoption or deployment, what have you. And in my mind, what I've seen is that that sort of work, creating that track record, finding those use cases, doing that iteration and proving out value, that should all be done in less than 90 days. Otherwise risking, stalled efforts or an inability to sort of string together those wins. And really sort of the cycle here, the iteration is, baselining current workflows and tasks, creating agentic or AI solutions and inserting them into the workflows, piloting those, measuring, say, time saved or ROI, iterating, and then moving on, going one workflow to the next. So backing up a little bit and starting with that MIT paper from last year, basically, the title of the paper is The Gen AI Divide. And essentially the Gen AI divide is pointing out the fact that while many organizations have experimented with generative AI tools, perhaps there's a handful of tools in use in an organization. Only a small minority have gone on to achieve some sort of meaningful operational or financial impact from those. So really it's calling out this critical gap between early experimentation and sort of more widespread, organizationally sanctioned transformative adoption and uptake of those AI tools. So, you can see here, and basically what they're talking about is, moving from pilot to production rollout. And that's what we address in this call. And the real attention-grabbing headline was that 95% of organizations are getting zero return on their AI initiatives. So before getting to what I think are the important salient points, just looking at what I think is off with the report in terms of methodology, in terms of conclusions. First, the study was conducted over just 6 months, I think from January to June, which is not a very long time, possibly not enough time to extrapolate and make sort of the conclusions as sweeping as they are that they did. Second, the measure of success here was looking for bottom line profitability on a P&L sheet within 6 months of starting an AI initiative, which is a pretty high bar to set. And I'm not really sure I'm aware of any technology that has been measured in the same way, where we think we've got a piece of emerging and transformative tech, and we start a project to inspect that and see what we can do with it, and put, in terms of the time frame, a bottom line P&L impact in just 2 quarters. So that's a little heavy-handed in my mind. The other thing too is the study overwhelmingly contained more build versus buy scenarios. And by its own admission, it overwhelmingly focused on organizations that chose to build their own AI solutions, whether that was LLM models or agentic workflows, rather than starting with a partner solution, something off the shelf, or human and an assistant framework before moving on to agents. So this will be a theme that comes up continually again for us. And then lastly, it was a small sample size with very limited quantitative data. This paper was basically conducted with 52 organizations, and the data and feedback they got was really from surveys of executive leaders, 153 of which. So part of the issue there is, it's not a lot of organizations to make broad conclusions from, but also, as we'll get into a little bit here, surveying senior leadership might not have visibility into the day-to-day personnel and workflows that are being affected by AI-assisted tasks. So whether or not they could speak to what the impact is, even in a qualitative sense, is probably severely limited. So I think that's a few blind spots perhaps in that MIT paper. But the things I think the paper got right, and I think they're really durable and persistent, and I see them still today, we talk about them still today with our clients, are some of the following. First, success is less a function of model quality than approach. We know that this technology is consistently being changed and improved almost on a near weekly basis. So whatever the model benchmarks are, however that's gauged, it's very neck and neck. We're talking millisecond response times. We're talking these fractional units of measurement in terms of measuring a tool performance. But what the MIT paper shows, and what we found also just echoed in the field, is that an organization's failure to be able to move from a pilot to a production deployment is more a matter of learning and integration failures rather than model quality. So that was an important point. The other point, which we're going to be talking about just nonstop on this discussion, is, MIT recommends that folks sort of dispense with end-to-end process re-envisioning and look instead for narrow, high-value footholds where operational outcomes can be improved. And we'll talk more about what that means and how I approach that. But really, like, finding a very focused piece of work, optimizing that work, improving it with AI assistance, and then having that be one of those wins as a part of the track record, and then moving on to the next piece. Same thing, we're talking about small visible wins as the way to create that track record, to create that organizational buy-in, and to allow yourselves to have cooperative movement from one phase to the next in terms of the AI journey. And related to all this is basically, MIT said the same as, but where do we find these high impact ROI use cases? And the answer that MIT found, and which we find in our work with healthcare, is we're finding those in back of office, non-clinical functions first. So we identify non-clinical workflows and use cases first to prove out in a low risk fashion what ROI could be, scaling that, including that in our track record, and then moving on through other back of office functions before moving into clinical. And then of course we start with clinical low risk situations with human in the loop. This second to last bullet is, the tools with the low setup burden and fast time to value outperform enterprise heavy builds. So this is again tipping our cap to the fact that we shouldn't look for out of the gate end-to-end process, reconstruction. We shouldn't look out of the gate at creating automated workflows. We should first look to what's available to us where we can get the most time to value, and that's already in some ways suited for enterprise use. And the last piece I'll just gloss over, but we'll touch on towards the end, is given these sorts of considerations and the approaches that I'll suggest here further on, your AI partner, a vendor, deployment partner, change management consultant, etc., needs to behave less like a SaaS seller, like a traditional technology seller, and more like a business process outsourcing consultant, just given the nature of AI and given the nature of the work at hand. So yeah, I'll move on to, taking some of those themes and trying to get a little bit more practical and actionable about what we've seen succeed and extrapolating on that a little bit. So here's a verbatim from the MIT paper, but essentially it just reiterates a point that's going to be salient for this conversation. Is we're looking to string together small visible wins in order to quantify and measure those in order to build a case for or against us continuing to move forward with a more general and broad AI initiative. So, I think we've all heard about the usual components of AI success and initiatives. We heard it even before AI, involving, a few key ingredients: executive sponsorship, training, and change management in terms of communication, cultural change, etc. I'm not going to repeat those here. I think those are all well understood and rehearsed. But instead, I'll try to lay out some more practical areas where we've seen some pitfalls, and then look at it's almost the flip side about what's worked instead. And I'll do this by just approaching, I think, the Gen AI divide. I think that's a really helpful lens to look at some of the pitfalls of AI pilots and moving from a pilot to production use. Because really what the Gen AI divide is saying is it's really about how to scale AI use that yields ROI. So we start with under-supported rollouts or over-planning. And this is a bit of a mouthful because these are very high-level sorts of areas where we can run into trouble right out of the gate in terms of our thinking about and strategizing about our approach to introducing AI. So I'll start with under-supported, and the rest of the bullet points kind of talk to the over-planning piece. But the main issue with under-supported pilots and rollouts is that, they were never built to scale in the first place. And the Gen AI divide is all about this difficulty of scaling AI use. So an under-supported rollout could mean, say, insufficient licensing or insufficient organization around, use case identification, baselining, measurement, etc. And by that, I just mean we could just end up with a bunch of subjective, qualitative anecdotes rather than quantified ROI pieces of information. It could be insufficient training where folks just don't know what to do with it, or the change management piece as well. It could also be providing 5 different LLMs to folks and letting them see what gets the most, affinity or excitement. So those are all under-supported rollouts in my mind. The problem with those in my view is that, a small pilot, let's just say 20, let's give 20 licenses to IT and executives and see what they think. The issue with that is it sits outside of those workflows where value actually comes from. So you give a few individual licenses and they're using it for, let's say, personal productivity. That's sitting outside of the workflow where really that's where we want to find all of that value in ROI. Or we give, say, 20 licenses to our C-suite and say, let us know what you think, should we move forward with an initiative? Again, those are individual productivity. We're not seeing them as we would hope to in the wild as narrow slices of a process where we can maybe improve accuracy, save time, reduce risk, et cetera. The other thing too is with those sorts of rollouts, either limited in number or limited in use cases, there's just not enough signal density to be able to get some meaningful learnings from and to act on, either to iterate or course correct or things like that. There's just not enough data there. And again, if we're operating in silos or there's not enough data, the benefits are going to be kind of imperceptible to groups who will probably need to weigh in on go, no-go decisions, such as finance or operations. So that's the under-supported scenario and temptation. Then there's the over-planning scenario and temptation. So complex, large use cases are very attractive to myself as well, as I try to see what parts of my day-to-day work I can perhaps get some AI assistance for or even automate. But the problem is that it's not a fast way to prove something out. And some of that progress is lost if the whole program doesn't work. So part of the over-planning in my mind is this next bullet here. It's looking to be autonomous before you've been assistive. And we'll talk more about that, but it's looking really to create agents before we've given our workforce, let's just use Copilot, a Copilot AI assistant that we can sort of be more nimble with, has much less barrier to entry and faster time to value. That's another way of saying folks look to build first rather than buy first. Folks look to agentify large swaths of work rather than first looking to enable an AI assist and enhance the work that's already taking place with their teams. Same thing with the end-to-end envisioning process. We advocate for taking a slice of a process, starting there, and then continuing to take slices of the process while we experiment, optimize, and iterate. And of course, any sort of bespoke modeling, any sort of bespoke techniques or custom development, pro code or what have you, those are going to add timeline. Those might encounter issues that couldn't be anticipated, and those could ultimately, depending on the experience, kill or severely slow down your AI journey. What has worked, however, is just a lot of those sort of flip side of those. Going assistive first before autonomous. Finding narrow high impact use cases within those processes. Starting with slices of non-clinical back of office functions, such as PO rejection letters or eligibility determinations or things like that. Doing some organized but earnest experimentation and structuring that in a way that yields important insights and learnings. It's an intelligent failure. There's kind of, it's product development stuff. There's no bad failure in this case because we yield important learnings that we can iterate on. And then, of course, letting those who are actually involved in the day-to-day work become a maker and help us identify areas where we can optimize and improve. So that's what's worked, and that's where we find folks can pretty quickly move down this path here. So the heading here is assistive before autonomous, and this is something I actually believe in pretty strongly. Like everything else in life, there's always going to be a day one, a starting point. And some of you folks may already be well down here and be creating agents, but that's not the case for everybody. And I still think there's some interesting dynamics to be had and synergies to be had and efficiencies to be created within phase one and phase two here. But phase one is basically a human with assistant. And this is where employees have an AI assistant like Copilot that helps them work better and faster, helps them perhaps improve the quality of their output or reduce the amount of error in their output. But it's very human in the loop. Humans are deriving this, actually entering in prompts into Copilot, and perhaps iterating on those prompts until those outputs are exactly where they need to be in terms of getting the work done. So in this phase one, human with assistant, the agent really helps the human get more done. And we're not reimagining work just yet. We're not fundamentally changing people's role. Rather, we're just making their existing work more efficient, higher quality, less error prone. Then phase two, human-led agents, is where now we start to create these agents. And agents are really like digital colleagues. Rather than an assistant, it's a digital colleague that has skills and sort of core competencies in a certain area. Now, humans are still in the loop. Humans are still responsible for critiquing the work, etc. But it's like an agent boss. And now you'd have multiple agents providing different aspects of expertise to round out the human skill set. So for example, if I'm just in, say, a supply chain workflow or procurement workflows, I can have multiple agents who are variously responsible for elements of an RFP or elements of an audit or things like that. And then phase three, we don't see a lot of folks here. We don't see a lot of organizations in healthcare here, but we do know it's on the way. This is where humans are much less in the loop and checking in periodically rather than remaining in the loop for work to progress. And really, in my mind, we see this with cloud-born, AI-born, say, startups and folks like that. So this is actually the framework that most folks agree with, and it starts with human versus assistant. So what does assistive look like? It's about the work, not the technology. So AI, I think we all get it. It's very interesting. It's general intelligence, meaning it's not purpose-built. So it's not like it's been created for a specific task or function that's intuitively and immediately known. And because it's not purpose-built, individuals, departments, organizations will need to understand its capabilities and then understand where we can fit those capabilities, incorporate those capabilities into our own unique workflows. And this is where, this is where we start to look more like a business process outsourcer than, say, a SaaS sales executive. Assistive work looks like also enabling and empowering your team to become organized, capable makers. So this is a little bit different than the sort of the usual stuff we've all heard many times before about, executive sponsorship, change management, etc. What this means is your frontline workers, let's say frontline information workers, they're going to be actually providing use cases and iterating on prompts and prompt chains and things like that to improve their work, improve the outputs of their work. They're going to, in a sense, become like micro product managers where they're iterating on a product and they're constantly improving their end results. So equipping them with the knowledge they would need to do that and providing the structure with which they could do that will be important and helps accelerate the success for sure. And then, of course, unlike the MIT paper, I don't think a senior executive will have much insight into the specifics about how a Copilot agent has helped, say, their procurement team or Office of General Counsel carry out a specific piece of work. The people who are doing that will need to assess, refine, etc. And of course, we're relying on them to identify those high impact use cases, which are so critical to us putting together a track record. But I'm guessing, too, folks are like, well, how does this get us? How does assistive get us to autonomous? And in my mind, and what I've seen, is that these iterations with human plus assistant and the work being done with human plus assistant actually provides a necessary and critical path to automation and autonomous agents. In a way, well, I shouldn't say necessary, but it does so in a way that is very attractive and for reasons that are pretty reasonable. So, the human plus assistant is, as we see here, it is very much a part of that frontier journey, frontier path, the path to agents, but it makes it low risk and allows us to accelerate that in the following ways. I mean, just a side note, I used to be a project manager, and I just always think about, the sort of classic example of building like an ERP system from scratch and doing that in a waterfall fashion. And, at the end of this very expensive and lengthy process, we find that it's not meeting requirements, or we find that the technology has changed. So that's kind of the context in which I approach, like, well, how does assistive get us to autonomous? And the way we actually see it playing out, and I'm meeting tomorrow with a healthcare organization who's doing this, is human and assistant are identifying workflows, are creating a set of prompt chains and processes that are AI assisted to help with those workflows. And we're baselining, we're measuring, we're piloting, and then we're improving and optimizing those prompt chains, those outputs that we're getting, until we're very comfortable with the quality of work that's being responded to and given to us. And then we're enabling, right? So then, I sit in a certain group, I've done this work, my manager, sees what I'm doing, sees the output, it goes through the normal sort of human in the loop controls. Then I can enable the rest of my team to do that. And then we can measure, okay, well, what does that look like when I've got 5 people doing this, 25 people doing this, in terms of time savings and ROI and our KPIs. But what I have now is I have a set of prompts. I've got this real logic that's been worked out and it's been optimized. And it's been done so in a way that's very lightweight, that any capable user who's familiar with the work, who can critique the work, who can do the task decomposition, who can provide the feedback and the feedback loops, we now have everything we would need to then go ahead and, let's just say, codify that into an agent, whether that's low code, no code, or pro code. We have exactly what we need. We don't have to go through those cycles, certainly not to the same extent, when we move into an agent and development environment. So this is now, it's almost a flywheel. This has become much of an accelerant to agents, rather than when are we going to get past human plus assistant and move to the fun stuff, which is agents. So in my mind, and you get this pipeline of work, and I meet with a healthcare organization tomorrow. They're doing this very well. In fact, these folks were a year and change ago, 14 months ago, they were considering other LLMs. They were not clear about what their AI platform would be for the next 3 to 5 years. Ultimately, they decided on Copilot. We did some pilot activity with them, which I'll review. But now, in just that short span of time, now they are creating agents, and they're doing it well and quickly because they first start proving things out with human plus assistant. So in my mind, this framework is low cost, certainly than just starting from scratch in that phase 2, designing business requirements, et cetera, and starting development. It's lower risk because we know at least the prompts work, and we can continue to see AI efficiencies in our work while the development's taking place in phase 2. And it's faster time to value because now we don't have people going around collecting business requirements. We know what the business requirements are. We've got that very clear and documented. And it's a whole pipeline where we can sort that by whatever sort of rubric we would normally sort our development pipelines and our tool pipelines on. So that's really exciting. And I think it's a very organic, natural, and I hate to use the word synergy, but synergistic relation between human plus assistant and then agents. So use cases, identifying the use cases are very important, as we mentioned, because we want to target high value, high impact use cases that also have not a lot of risk assigned to them in terms of legal and compliance risk, or PHI or PII data, or risk of, if I get this output wrong, what would be the consequence? And I provided a framework here, which we'll share with you as a leave behind. Essentially, it's what you think it would be. Is the work to be done, or is this part of the process, is it rules-based and repetitive? Do I have good data to put to it? Or good data that I don't have regulatory concerns about? Basically, could I map out on the back of a napkin at lunch what that workflow looks like, where it's sufficiently clear that I can now just translate that into, say, a prompt chain or something like that? So this will be shared with you folks. And then when we have those use cases, or where to start parking those use cases is in something like a scoring rubric. And so I will share this with you folks as well. Let me just move this over here. Maybe you'll find this helpful, I hope so. But this is just a worksheet that has the use case identification sort of criteria in there as well, or heuristic. It helps you identify ones that are likely good for first enablement. And then we've got a little bit of inputs and legend here. So you could put in your hourly rate, your average hourly rate, fully burdened with insurance, et cetera. How much your AI licensing costs here. This is AI Copilot. What your break-even point would be based upon those license costs. How many AI-assisted hours you would need to break even. And then a per user breakdown of, well, if Microsoft Copilot is $30 per user per month, really we just need to see a half an hour of time saved or value generated per user per month for us to break even. And then here I've got the actual rubric, which is, business value. Is this high impact or low impact? Integration complexity. How difficult is it going to be to put something like this, to access the data, to have the systems in place to be able to, say, reason over this information? And then the enterprise risk. Is the process itself critical and risky? Is the data itself critical and risky? We can measure that. And all of these weights, you can change yourself, and it all sort of cascades down. But then we've got like this sort of use case organization here, use case, role, department. And then we've got the sort of rubric here. So if something has, high business value and let's just say very low complexity and very low risk, great. This is opportunistic for us to maybe shortlist in terms of our AI pilot to be able to start demonstrating and documenting ROI for these use cases. That'll help us build that track record. And in the interest of time, I won't dwell too much on it, but we even have some forecasts here. Like if I could shave off 20% of this effort here, what might my potential savings be based on the frequency of use and number of minutes that are baselined, et cetera. So yeah, would love to send that to you folks. Hopefully you find that helpful. But that's sort of the framework and sort of the organization and discipline, I meant to allude to when talking earlier about that. And those use cases become that pipeline for that agent development as well. But there'd be, of course, more documentation because now we've got very specific details about requirements, outputs, what the inputs are, et cetera. So switching gears a little bit, so assuming that this is the right way to move forward with any AI initiative, and I believe that's the case. I've seen both the good and the bad, and folks that are doing this, organizations that are doing this and starting at these sort of reasonable, crawl, walk, run points are able to quickly, in the course of 8 to 14 months, are able to pretty quickly move into clinical settings as well as move into agentic development. So what does a good AI partner look like? Now, this is not Revanti specific, although we live and breathe this, but I'll just call out that highlighted piece there. According to the MIT paper, and I loved this, I sort of latched onto it. A good partner acts like a BPO client, not a SaaS customer. And so, I've got a little table here. It might be a little bit reductive, right? I may be a little rough on SaaS sales executives, but I think you get the idea here. We're talking less about a product and features and capabilities and monthly active use and things like that. And we're talking more about work, and we're talking more about not just work in general, not just healthcare in general. We're talking about what is your work and what is your work at this level in this department, and digging into those details, because AI by its nature has to be bespoke to see ROI. It needs to be this case. So we need to be thinking and approaching organizations in our work more in this advisory consultative way. So, we're looking at KPIs that are fundamentally different than what you would be looking at KPIs for, say, in just a product. And I've got a little hot take here, but I kind of like it. A strong and effective AI partner should, maybe this. Behave like a BPO consultant that happens to use AI, rather than a SaaS company that happens to sell AI. And, when we start to look at things through that lens, through generative AI not being purpose-built, for it requiring us looking at the work, less so the product, more the work, and not just the work in an abstract, but getting very specific and detailed about that. Well, now we start to have really cool and fun conversations. I think they're cool and fun. And the folks I work with that do this get into these things, and it leads to really great results, really great conversations, really great insights and aha moments. So just to pick a few of these randomly, but like, who's responsible for the throughput, quality, and exceptions for a specific process? Who gets that call if something goes wrong? We need to speak to that person. We need to understand what sort of quality control, quality assurance is happening in that process, where things are bottlenecked, where they're not. I mean, the other one I love too is, what are your most expensive people? Where are they doing the least differentiated work? That seems like it should be real opportunistic for AI assistance. And then, of course, where are you, adding headcount but not reducing cycle time? So like where is there a lot of demand or increasing demand, but we're still having troubles reducing those cycle times? And if we could lessen those cycle times, what would you now do with that time back? So love those conversations, super interesting and absolutely necessary for basically what we do with AI deployments. So we've sort of got, a whole journey, a number of different sort of engagement types that we do for various phases in the AI journey. For example, the Copilot Executive Summary. This is if you're considering a different AI tool. We can talk to you pretty objectively about Copilot versus ChatGPT versus Gemini versus Claude. We can talk to you about that and give you some objective considerations about what should go into that decision. Copilot Explorer is really just a standalone business requirements discussion. We elicit and we have those discussions like a BPO consultant to identify those use cases, sort of quantify and forecast on them like we saw earlier. There's some data security here, which I haven't gotten into much, but we often meet with information security teams to make sure that they are understanding and on board with the requirements and the work we'll do in order to enable AI. But today we're sort of talking about Copilot Pack 365. This is essentially a 50+ user Copilot pilot. And this takes us sort of right up to that precipice of the Gen AI divide, right? We want to go from pilot into production here. So what do we need to do in the pilot in order to get us all of that information in order to justify the move into production? Well, this is where the engagement is really structured for that purpose. All of our pilots have two concurrent tracks. A data readiness track, which is data security, so that the responses Copilot's returning are appropriate to people's permissions. And the adoption and change management piece, which is mostly what we've been discussing here, to identify use cases, create custom training to those specific use cases that we've identified together, to deliver that, and then to measure the results based upon baselines. So that's sort of the high level of how our pilots are structured. And really, we just want to do three things here. We want to enable your pilot users in terms of training and in terms of use case identification and that custom training for those use cases, and providing that support in terms of office hours, materials, things like that. We want to allow those folks to have the best possible chance at giving AI the best possible evaluation. And then with the evaluation, we provide quantitative and qualitative analysis that's really designed to help teams and leaderships and organizations make that decision about whether or not to take on that next stage, moving from pilot to production rollout. And if that decision were yes, based upon what we've seen, we want to move to production rollout, we then help sort of do some license rationalization and some planning around that. So for example, you should know, typically organizations look at 3 different flavors of AI should they move into production. There's a free Microsoft Copilot chat version, no employee left behind. Everyone would have a free AI assistant to incorporate into their work. There's Teams Premium for folks that, like in this scenario, need some transcription, need some translation services, need agendas, notes, etc. in these sorts of contexts on Teams. And then there's M365 Copilot, which is, of course, probably more for information workers who are needing to reference and reason over, say, organizational data and documents to get their work done. We sort of create personas for each of those folks and help organizations figure out what makes sense, what are we looking at in terms of license distribution based upon that pilot. And I'll gloss over this, but here's some sample adoption and change management deliverables from the pilot. But it all kind of, in my mind, it really sort of culminates in this prioritized use case, which is basically a dashboard that we set up for you, and which eventually becomes, at the end of the project, a pipeline for further work, initiative, measurement, iteration. We are close to time, but really this is like a 8 to 12 week sort of exercise. Again, if you're not doing it in 90 days, I start to get worried about whether we've looking at too much process rather than narrow workflows, whether we're proving out what we set out to. And really the 8 to 12 weeks, it's really based on our clients' preferences. So we found, we could do it in as little as 8 weeks, but folks really just want more supported time with their pilot teams to be able to assess Copilot in this structured way. But the real capstone is the success results review, which this is just 2 slides examples of. So this is what we meant by providing organizations with the information needed to make an informed decision about whether to cross the Gen AI divide, to whether to go from pilot to production rollout. And this is an actual result. This was 61 pilot users over 21 working days, where in that time, we had 747 Copilot assisted hours based upon the average hourly rate they gave us, which was $72 an hour, to come to about $54,000 worth in Copilot assisted value. And this is sort of a roll-up slide. There's a lot that goes into this number and a lot that we unpack in that sort of results review discussion. But this gives you an idea. Again, it's an actual example. It gives you an idea about the magnitude. Are we talking hundreds of dollars? Are we talking thousands of dollars? This is essentially what we're talking about, and this has been replicated elsewhere. But in addition to that, we have qualitative results. We do pre and post surveys. We want that qual data because it's fantastic. And it is informative, and it does help supplement the quantitative data. So this, again, is just one of many sort of qualitative slide feedback, but I think it gives you the idea about, would you recommend Copilot to your colleague? Has it improved your productivity? All these variety of questions. Essentially, for me, I used to be a product manager as well. The main question for me is, if I took this product away from you, if I took Copilot away from you at the end of the pilot and never gave it back, how would you feel? And if that answer is, I would be upset or I would have some strong feelings about it, you've got some real affinity and need for the product in the organization. Anyway, I know I've been pretty close to time here. I hope it's interesting. And if there's any questions or comments, I'm happy to address those.